My name is Cora Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and at 8:11 on a Thursday night, while wilting white roses and red wine hung in the air of a downtown hotel ballroom, my mother finally said the thing this family had been rehearsing around me for years. Auction paddles clattered against linen tables. Donor glasses tapped softly at the back of the room. I was standing near the side stage with my phone in one hand, a marked-up grant restriction report still open from the afternoon, and the donor portal alerts I had checked between speeches because scholarship foundations, unlike families, do not stop needing compliance just because a memorial band starts playing. Then Elaine Bennett took the microphone, placed my father's foundation folder into my younger sister Marissa's hands, and said, "A woman like you can manage money, Cora, but not a legacy." She said it in front of board members, student families, two major donors, Howard, and the local reporter my mother had invited because she thought grief looked cleaner under good lighting. That line should have humiliated me into tears. Instead, it clarified everything. I did not remind her who rebuilt the donor reports after funding fell off, who cleaned up restricted fund errors, who fixed the filing calendar, who sat with audit language until midnight while Marissa smiled through luncheons and got called the warm face of my father's mission. I just stood there, with old roses, hotel carpet, and public shame settling into something colder and more useful. This was not a new wound. It was a system. Marissa got paraded. I got deployed. Marissa got the microphone. I got the filings, the board packets, the endowment controls, and every ugly little crisis nobody wanted attached to the family name. In that family, I was good enough to keep the charity legal, just never good enough to be named as part of its legacy. So when my mother finished speaking and people started clapping because rooms like that always clap before they think, I sent one text to my counsel: "Keep everything frozen." Then I stepped off the side stage before anyone could ask me to smile beside my sister for photos. 4 days later, the grant board and donor platform called because Marissa had already launched a new chapter campaign, promised scholarship awards, and started talking like the foundation belonged to her. But the endowment controls, donor portal, and state filing chain still ended in my name. Before I tell you what froze first, and why my mother suddenly needed me to do this for my father, tell me what time it is where you are, and where you're watching from. I always want to know how far a story like this travels before it lands on someone who already knows what it feels like to carry the legacy and still get erased from the stage. Here's what they didn't understand when my mother put that foundation folder into Marissa's hands under ballroom lighting and called it legacy. They thought they were doing what they had always done: give the visible daughter the warmth, push the practical daughter into function, and trust that I would keep the machinery underneath it all running, because I always had. What they were actually doing was launching a public leadership story on top of a nonprofit structure they did not control. I work in nonprofit finance and grant compliance, which means I do not hear phrases like new chapter, honoring Dad's vision, or carrying the mission forward the way my mother does. I hear restricted funds, endowment release authority, donor reporting liability, filing exposure, board governance defects, and the exact point where family sentiment starts pretending it can outrun law. 5 years earlier, after my father died and the scholarship foundation started drifting from grief into sloppiness, I did the work nobody in my family wanted attached to their names. I rebuilt donor reporting after 2 major contributors threatened to walk. I cleaned up restricted fund errors that had been casually described as timing mix-ups until I traced them back to actual violations. I restored credibility with the grant board after 1 missed sequence and 1 badly handled disbursement nearly got us flagged as unserious. I tied the endowment release process to a cleaner control path because my mother liked announcing awards before money was actually lawful to move. I became the primary administrator on the donor and grant portal because no one else in that family could be trusted not to confuse access with authority. And when annual state and IRS filing risk got sharp enough to stop sounding theoretical, my name became the compliance signer on the chain because somebody had to be the adult in a room full of memorial language and soft chaos. None of that photographed well. Marissa still got to be the one smiling at students, hugging donors, and talking about impact in warm tones, while people mistook softness for structure. I got the board packets, portal reconciliations, endowment controls, scholarship restrictions, and the old humiliation of being treated like paid infrastructure inside a family legacy that would have gone off the rails without me. By 7:26 the next morning after the gala, I was at my kitchen table with cold coffee beside my laptop, pulling the whole foundation chain into one clean folder because I already knew Thursday had not ended at insult. It had moved into exposure. Endowment control documents first, with my authority still sitting there in the release path. Then the donor portal admin logs. Then the board resolutions, the grant restriction reports, the filing confirmations, and the wire logs from the months my mother now likes to call that difficult period after your father passed, as if grief itself had somehow cleaned up ledger errors and compliance deadlines. After that, I opened Elaine's old emails, which read almost indecently clear once I stripped the mother tone off them. Fix the foundation quietly. Do not frighten Marissa with compliance language. Your sister is what donors respond to. Do this for your father. There it was again. Marissa got the room. I got the risk. She got the crown. I got the legal chain beneath it. At 8:14 Monday morning, I made the first professional move. I did not call my mother and ask whether she had already told donors, students, or the board that Marissa was the new executive face in any lawful sense. I did not send my sister one wounded message about erasure or what it means to inherit a microphone instead of a filing burden. I confirmed the endowment authority path, checked the donor portal permissions, reviewed the pending state filing sequence, and emailed the Foundation Counsel and Grant Board liaison, instructing them to route any inquiry tied to leadership transition, scholarship release, or portal control through me in writing. Then I sent a second note to the donor platform and our accounting contact, confirming that no transfer of endowment authority, portal administration, or compliance signer responsibility had been executed, and that any public representation suggesting otherwise should be treated as premature. No speech, no grief performance, just the end of assumption. The consequences hit faster than I expected. By Monday afternoon, the donor platform wanted to know whether Marissa's campaign posts reflected a real control change or just public branding. By Tuesday morning, the grant board asked whether the spring scholarship awards she had already started promising were actually approved for release under the current governance structure. That was when the bigger stake surfaced. This was not just about my mother humiliating me at a memorial gala and installing my sister as the prettier face of my father's charity. Marissa had already started speaking as though money could move, awards could be promised, and students could be publicly attached to a campaign she did not control. If that continued, the damage would not stop at family shame. Restricted funds, donor trust, and filing integrity would all start collapsing in the same direction. Funny how quickly be the bigger person turns into, why aren't you answering, once the mission they used as decor starts depending on the daughter they tried to erase. They thought they had replaced the difficult one. What they actually did was announce a transition on top of a locked financial spine, and the first people to notice were never going to be family. They were going to be the ones who read the filings. By 8:41 Tuesday morning, the tone had already shifted from condescending to alarmed. Not because anyone in my family had found a conscience, not because my mother woke up ashamed that she had handed my father's foundation folder to Marissa in front of donors, students, and a ballroom full of people who had no idea whose hands were actually keeping the charity legal. Because the systems had started answering back. I was in my office with one screen on a school-based grant reconciliation and another on the Bennett Foundation file when the donor platform called. The woman on the line introduced herself in the clipped, patient voice people use when they are trying very hard not to say someone has already created avoidable compliance risk. "Ms. Bennett, we need clarification on administrator authority," she said. "We are seeing campaign language and scholarship messaging from Ms. Marissa Bennett, but the active disbursement permissions, donor controls, and audit path still resolve to you." There it was. Not grief, not family tension, authority. I told her no transfer had been approved, no control path had changed, and all future questions needed to be routed to me in writing. Then I hung up and wrote the line that mattered most in my notes. Public succession story moving faster than control chain. At 8:56, the second call came from the grant board liaison, and her tone was even less forgiving. "Cora, I need to know whether the foundation has actually changed operational control," she said. "Your sister's campaign materials are already referring to spring scholarship awards as though release timing is settled. Under the current restriction schedule, that assumption is not hers to make." That was the first moment the scale of it widened. This was no longer just my mother humiliating me under hotel lights and expecting me to stay quiet because it was for Dad. Marissa had already started promising money she could not lawfully release. I told the liaison exactly what I told the donor platform. No transfer, no authority change, no approved substitution. Route everything in writing. By 9/11, both emails were in my inbox, and both carried the same institutional tone my family never recognizes early enough. "Clarify now or the file will do it for you." At 9:18, my mother called. At 9:23, she called again. At 9:29, my Uncle Howard left a voicemail in that grave, disappointed tone men use when they want coercion to sound like dignity. "Don't humiliate the family over technicalities," he said. "Your father would be devastated by this." There it was again. Their overreach, my humiliation, their dependence on my controls, my disrespect. I still did not answer because discipline is one of the only pleasures left when your family is certain you will eventually reorganize your whole life around their panic. At 9:37, the family thread woke up after 4 days of tribute photos, clipped newspaper mentions, and Marissa's little new chapter posts. Mom wrote, "Cora, answer the grant board." Marissa followed with, "This is literally just admin stuff." Howard added, "We have student families and donors already responding. Admin stuff." As if endowment release, donor controls, and state filing authority were decorative details instead of the structure that keeps a charity from becoming a cautionary tale in nice clothes. I let the messages sit and finished the grant reconciliation on my desk because I wanted one more ordinary piece of real work done before I stepped fully into the emergency they had manufactured. At 10:02, the outside escalation got personal. One of our long-term donors, a retired judge named Eleanor Ross, emailed asking whether Marissa's new campaign language meant the scholarship disbursement criteria had changed. Not because she cared about family politics, because serious donors read what they fund. 5 minutes later, the accounting contact for the endowment sent a note asking whether they should freeze the next release queue until governance and signer authority were confirmed. There it was. Not because my family missed me. Not because they regretted Saturday night. Because real money had started hearing a fake story. I answered both in writing. No disbursement changes. No governance transfer. No release assumption. Keep the controls in place. At 10:41, my mother finally sent the text that made the whole thing plain enough to stop pretending. "You need to calm down and stop making your sister look illegitimate. Not stop risking the foundation. Not stop promising scholarship awards under the wrong authority. Not stop confusing grief with governance. Just stop making Marissa look illegitimate. There it was. The whole family structure in one sentence. Marissa gets legitimacy by announcement. I get responsibility by default. She gets the room. I get the risk if it all goes wrong. I wrote that line into the chronology too, because sometimes the truest thing people say is the one they think sounds reasonable. At 11:07, Marissa called, and I answered because I wanted her panic before my mother translated it into something softer. She did not say hello. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Do you want student families thinking I'm lying?" I looked at the endowment control documents on one screen, the donor portal logs on another, and the 5 years of cleanup work that had kept my father's foundation from being reduced to memorial language and sloppy books. "You announced authority before you had it," I said. "That is not my work." She inhaled sharply. "So you're really going to block scholarships just to prove a point?" There was the inversion in its cleanest form. Their lie becomes my block. Their assumption becomes my cruelty. "No," I said. "The controls are doing what they're supposed to do." Then I hung up. By 11:36, the donor platform had formally frozen campaign-linked payout functions, pending administrator confirmation. By 11:48, the grant board had flagged the spring scholarship queue for governance review. By 12:03, our outside accountant copied Foundation Counsel on the filing sequence, because if Marissa was publicly presenting herself as director, the annual state and IRS chain could not be allowed to drift into ambiguity. The tone had changed from clarification to containment. I sent one sentence to Elaine, Marissa, Howard, counsel, and the accounting contact after that, and only because I wanted the words somewhere they could not revise later. "No transfer has been approved." Then I turned my phone face down and went back to the report in front of me. Because if I was going to be accused of dishonoring my father, I was at least going to do it after finishing the kind of real work he had spent his life teaching me mattered more than applause. What would you do when the same family that told you to be the bigger person only started panicking once donors, the grant board, and the filing chain all learned your name was still the one holding their legacy together? The next morning, the problem changed categories. Up to that point, my mother still thought this was about whether I was being generous enough. Marissa still thought it was about whether I was jealous enough to interrupt her spotlight. And Howard clearly believed the right mix of grief language and family pressure could flatten the whole thing into one more back-end mess I would absorb, because I always had. But at 8:09 Wednesday morning, the grant board sent its formal governance concern. The donor platform forwarded the administrative freeze notice, and our outside accountant flagged the annual filing chain for authority verification. The wording on those 3 documents made my whole body go cold in a way the gala had not. The issue was no longer whether my feelings had been hurt on a ballroom side stage. It was whether my name was being publicly leveraged inside an endowment structure, a donor control system, and a state and IRS compliance chain I had never approved for transfer. That was when the story stopped being about grief and became about self-preservation. I called the outside accountant first and asked the only question that mattered. Has anyone represented directly or indirectly that I already approved a leadership transition and that the remaining issue is just administrative timing? He did not answer immediately, which in nonprofit finance is usually the answer. Then he said, carefully, "Your mother described it as a family succession already understood in principle. Our problem is that the public campaign language does not match the authorized control path." Understood in principle. There it was. The Bennett family religion translated into compliance language. My work was assumed. My consent was atmospheric. Marissa's little public crown fantasy was apparently more real than the control chain I had spent 5 years rebuilding after donor losses, restricted fund errors, and filing risk nearly hollowed the foundation out from the inside. I thanked him, hung up, and opened a new folder on my desktop labeled exactly what the situation had become: Bennett Foundation, unauthorized transition assumption, full record. Then I built the path the way I build every file that needs to survive charm, denial, and my mother's soft-voiced revisionism. Endowment control documents first, with my name still sitting in the disbursement authority line. Then the donor portal administrator logs, showing every campaign control and release function still resolving through me. Then the board resolutions, grant restriction reports, state charity filing confirmations, IRS submission trail, and wire logs from the years my mother now likes to call that difficult period after your father passed, as if grief itself had somehow corrected misuse, reconciled reporting, or restored credibility with people who were already halfway to walking. After that, I opened Elaine's texts and emails, and once I stripped away the mother voice, they read less like pleas and more like an operating manual for how this family had always used me. Fix the foundation quietly. Do not frighten Marissa with governance language. Your sister is what donors respond to. Do this for your father. Do not punish us with paperwork. Punish. There it was again. Not gratitude. Not trust. Not partnership. Image. I thought about being 31 and rebuilding the donor restriction ledger while Marissa stood at a luncheon talking about hope in a dress somebody else paid for. I thought about being 33 and correcting scholarship disbursement errors at midnight because the board packet my mother called basically done had been held together with wishful thinking and a stapler. I thought about being 35 and sitting across from a grant reviewer hearing, very politely, that one more reporting mistake would permanently damage the foundation's credibility, then coming home to hear my mother say Marissa had the warmth your father loved most. Every time I fixed it, they called me dutiful. Every time I protected myself, they called me cold. The difference now was that official people had started asking official questions, and once that happens, even family grief starts sounding like a press release. At 10:16, the donor platform sent the official bridge I needed. If public-facing campaign language continued under Marissa's direction while the active administrator remained unchanged, then the problem was no longer internal disrespect. It was active misrepresentation tied to donor solicitation, restricted disbursement, and governance exposure. That moved the whole story out of the realm of sibling injury and into professional contamination. If donors gave under her new chapter authority, if scholarship families were promised awards under the wrong control path, or if the state and IRS filing chain drifted while she was being publicly presented as the foundation's new director, then my family was not just erasing me. They were trying to spend my credibility after publicly downgrading it. That is how women like me get used in legacy institutions. First, we save the system. Then we get told the smile is the real inheritance. At 10:43, my mother called from the foundation office line, which meant she was done pretending to sound wounded and ready to sound managerial. I answered because by then I wanted her plain voice, not the mother voice she uses when she wants access to sound like love. "This has gone far enough," she said. "No hello, no Cora. Donors are asking questions, the board is becoming dramatic, and you are not going to turn your father's name into a legal issue because your sister had one good moment on stage." I asked, "Did you tell them I had already agreed?" Silence. Then, I told them the family had this handled. I wrote that down too. Because it was not just dishonest, it was revealing. My mother had never believed my authority was real authority. She believed it was back-office labor with a login attached, the kind of thing that should dissolve the second the daughter she preferred needed the microphone. "No," I told her. "What you want is not unity, it's retroactive permission." She went sharp immediately. "After everything your father built, you owe your sister a clean transition." Oh, there it was again. Debt. The debt I was apparently supposed to keep paying because I knew how to stop a memorial charity from rotting under sloppy governance while everyone else arranged flowers around his name. "What I owe," I said, "is accuracy to every filing, control, and donor promise carrying my signature." Then I ended the call, and sent one written instruction to the grant board, donor platform, outside accountant, foundation counsel, and board treasurer, confirming that no transfer of endowment authority, donor portal administration, scholarship release control, or compliance signer responsibility had been approved, and that any contrary representation should be treated as unauthorized. At 11:18, Marissa texted, "Mom says you're doing this because no one ever wanted you as the public face." I read it once and filed it, because by then I could finally name the relationship accurately enough to stop bleeding inside it. This was not grief under pressure, not family carrying a legacy forward, not a daughter stepping into service. It was access dressed up as mission, not love, not remembrance, extraction in formal wear. The spring scholarship luncheon started at 12 sharp on a Friday, and I walked into the hotel ballroom at 12:17 because timing matters when people are still relaxed enough inside their own lie to keep performing it. The room had been staged for moral innocence, white linen over round tables, little blue scholarship brochures fanned beside the water glasses, a slideshow of my father's face dissolving into smiling student portraits on two side screens. Donors in summer suits and careful pearls speaking in low voices near the registration table. Student families lined up for photos beneath a banner that read, "The Bennett Foundation, a new chapter of impact." That line alone would have been enough, but my mother had not stopped there. Marissa stood near the podium in a cream-sheath dress with the foundation pin on her lapel, smiling in that bright, polished way women smile when they think witnesses can make authority real. The board representative sat 3 tables from the front, with a leather folder open on her place setting. A local reporter from the education beat was near the back wall. 2 major donors were already seated. Good. The right room was full. My mother saw me first and crossed from the registration area quickly, smile still attached but thinner now. "Cora," she said under her breath, "do not humiliate your father like this." There it was again. Their public fiction, my disloyalty. Their staged transfer, my timing. "You already did that when you announced a director before the control chain existed," I said. Marissa turned at the sound of my voice and lifted her chin just enough for the nearest donor and one student mother to hear. "Look who finally came to support the students," she said. That was my ignition line handed to me for free. Support would have been a strange word to use before you started promising scholarship money under systems you do not control, I said. The room did not go silent all at once. It thinned. One donor lowered his program. The reporter stopped typing. The board representative did not move at all, which told me she had already come prepared to watch the file speak. I set my folder on the registration table beside the name tags and opened it without hurry. Endowment control documents, donor portal admin log, board resolution chain, grant restriction report, freeze notice. Then I turned the top pages toward the board representative and the 2 major donors, instead of toward my family, because practical people are usually the first honest ones left in rooms like that. Before anyone here keeps speaking as though Marissa Bennett is already the lawful executive authority of this foundation, I said, the endowment controls, donor disbursement functions, and compliance signer chain are all still in my name, and no transfer has been approved. Marissa laughed too fast. "Oh my God, are you seriously doing this in front of students?" "You did it first," I said. "You just did it with brochures and grief branding." That line moved through the room because even the people who did not understand the full compliance structure understood the shape of the lie. My mother stepped closer and lowered her voice into that sharp whisper she always used when she wanted morality to sound like etiquette. "Be the bigger person." "No," I said. "Be accurate." Then I lifted the donor platform freeze notice and read the line out loud. Campaign-linked payout function suspended, pending confirmation of lawful administrator authority. I looked at the board representative, not my mother. Did I ever tell the board or the platform that Marissa had authority to promise spring scholarship awards? Her face changed the exact way competent women's faces change when they are done protecting someone else's family image. No, she said. Quiet, but clear. That mattered. One of the student fathers frowned. A donor near the front finally took off his glasses. The room was starting to understand itself. I picked up the grant restriction report next. These awards were already being spoken about publicly, I said, while the restricted fund release path remained frozen, and the annual filing chain still resolved through me. So let's be plain. The promises were emotional. The controls were not. There it was. The lie dying in administrative language, not in a scream, in sequence, in the sound of a room realizing the warm public daughter had been standing on top of somebody else's legal spine. My mother went pale, then angry. After everything your father built, you would shame your own sister in front of donors? She hissed. I looked at the students, the donors, the banner, the foundation my father had loved enough to build, and my family had loved enough to decorate, but not enough to govern, and then back at her. You used my silence as part of the program, I said. I'm just the first person in the room willing to remove it. That was the end of the performance, even if no one cried yet, because the room turned procedural. The board representative opened her folder wider. The reporter started writing again. One donor quietly asked whether today's award announcements were even authorized. A student mother stopped smiling for the photographer. Marissa's face held for one more second, then cracked. You're humiliating me over paperwork, she snapped. There was the inversion exactly where it always shows up. Endowment control becomes paperwork. Donor authority becomes paperwork. Compliance becomes paperwork. Women like me are always expected to carry the file quietly until the moment we use it, and then suddenly the entire structure becomes just paperwork. No, I said. I'm refusing to let governance be erased into performance. Then the board representative stood up, not dramatically, just enough. Until administrator authority and release controls are lawfully clarified, no public commitment of scholarship disbursement should be treated as final, she said. That was the sentence that killed the room. One donor closed his luncheon folder. The reporter stepped closer. My mother looked at Marissa the way women like her always do when the prettier daughter finally becomes expensive. I closed my file, picked it up, and stepped away before the moment could cheapen itself into tears and amateur grief speeches. At the ballroom doors, Marissa called after me, voice cracking now. So, what? This is revenge? I turned once. No, I said. This is what a control freeze sounds like when the microphone stops working. Then I walked out into the Raleigh heat while the luncheon kept trying to breathe behind me without clean disbursements, without easy mythology, and without the daughter they had always counted on to make the ugly part invisible. The scholarship luncheon did not make me feel vindicated. It did not send me home glowing with justice or standing in my kitchen replaying Marissa's face with anything that looked like peace. It made me feel wired, ashamed, and so awake at 2:09 a.m. that I was sitting at my dining table with one lamp on, my heels kicked under the chair, and a yellow legal pad in front of me, because some old part of my body still believed stopping the family machine was more dangerous than being fed into it. That is the part people lie about when they tell stories like this badly. They pretend public truth feels like relief the second it is spoken. It doesn't. Not when your body was trained for years to believe your value lived in how quietly you could absorb the damage before anyone else had to see it. By Saturday morning, the tactics shift had already started. My mother texted first, saying donors were confused, student families were upset, and I had embarrassed my father's memory in front of people who never needed to witness private family pain. Howard followed with the practical version, saying the board representative was making governance sound worse than it is. The reporter was asking questions, and I had turned one emotional family transition into a public scandal. Marissa's messages were worse because favored daughters always reach for moral inversion once ease stops working. The first called me bitter. The second said I had always mistaken control for meaning. The third said I would rather poison Dad's name than let her do one good thing. The fourth was the truest without meaning to be. You could have just let me have this. There it was again. The whole Bennett theology in one sentence. Let the visible daughter have the room. Let the practical daughter have the burden. Let me carry the endowment, the donor controls, the filing chain, the restricted fund cleanup, the audit risk, the ugly back end, and then call me cruel the second I refuse to disappear behind it. What unsettled me most was not what they said. It was the old, conditioned part of me that still wanted permission. Permission to stop rescuing. Permission to stop cushioning. Permission to stop translating my mother's panic into process just because I knew how. So instead of answering them, I did what my family has always hated most. I took the pattern somewhere honest. My therapist, Naomi Pike, has an office above a law practice near Cameron Village that smells faintly like cedar and old printer heat. And by Monday afternoon, I was sitting across from her with my blazer still on, because I knew if I got comfortable first, I would start minimizing. I gave her the facts in order, because order is the only form my mind trusts when family starts lying. The memorial gala, the microphone, my mother's line, the donor platform freeze, the grant board warning, the scholarship luncheon, the reporter, the board representative standing up, my mother calling all of it humiliation when what she meant was interruption. Naomi let me finish, then asked the one question that cut the story open. When did your family first teach you that competence was the price of being kept close? I looked at the edge of her bookshelf for a long time because I already knew the answer, and because saying it aloud would make it harder to romanticize later. I was 14 when I started fixing the donor thank you letters, because my mother said Marissa wasn't detail-oriented enough for that kind of pressure. I was 26 when I corrected our first restricted fund mistake and got praised for being the one who can handle the ugly parts. I was 31 when my father died, and the whole foundation slid toward administrative chaos, while my mother told people Marissa had the heart of the mission. Naomi did not tell me to forgive them. She asked the better question. How long have you been calling invisibility service? That one stayed in my ribs. I went home and wrote the pattern down the way I write any governance chronology that needs to survive scrutiny. Marissa gets introduced. I get assigned. Elaine promises. I stabilize. Howard moralizes. I clean. Public warmth on one side. Structural labor on the other. Once it was on paper, the guilt lost some of its holiness. It started looking less like conscience and more like conditioning. Then came the meeting. My mother texted Tuesday morning asking for one last adult conversation before this becomes permanent, which in my family has always meant let us rename the damage before the documents do it for us. I agreed, only because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could hide behind flowers, donor brochures, or my father's photograph. We met that afternoon in the foundation office after hours, old campaign binders stacked on the credenza, stale coffee trapped in the carpet, filing boxes along one wall, and my father's framed mission statement hanging over a room that had spent years confusing sentiment with governance. My mother started with revision. She said the gala line had been poorly phrased, not cruel. Marissa said the luncheon had only been meant to create momentum. Howard said no one expected me to make a public issue out of what should have stayed inside the family while everyone was still grieving. Then I laid the file down one document at a time. Endowment controls, donor portal logs, grant restriction reports, filing confirmations, wire logs. My mother's fix the foundation quietly emails. The room changed the way rooms always change when paper finally outruns tone. My mother snapped first. You always need documents to feel important. No, I said. I need documents when people around me keep trying to inherit what I kept lawful. Howard called me rigid. Marissa called me vindictive. Then she said the truest thing in the room by accident. You could have just signed it and let me do the public part. There it was. Not family, not legacy, access. Clean enough to stop pretending. Something inside me went very still then. Not dramatic, not wounded, just finished. I am not transferring control because you were handed a microphone, I said. I am not releasing endowment authority so you can keep performing leadership. I am not putting my name back under this foundation to protect another public fantasy. And I am done being the daughter you remember only when the systems stop cooperating. My mother called that cruel. Howard said I was making everything final over paperwork. Marissa started crying in that furious, breathless way favored people do when consequence refuses to reorganize itself around their comfort. I stood up anyway. No, I said. I'm just done being your invisible governance. Then I took my file and left them in that office while they were still trying to turn consequences back into disrespect. The fallout took a little over 5 weeks, and the reason it landed so hard was that it moved through the dull adult places first. Not through dramatic scenes. Not through one giant donor revolt. Through governance notes, payout freezes, filing scrutiny, board hesitation, and the kind of written clarification that makes family mythology sound childish the second it touches a real record. The donor platform did not shut the foundation down, which would have been too clean. It did something worse. It froze the campaign-linked disbursement path and documented why. The grant board did not strip the foundation of credibility in one public gesture. It started asking precise questions in writing. Who had authority to promise scholarship awards? Who controlled the next endowment release? Whether a public leadership transition had been announced before any lawful governance vote, signer update, or filing amendment existed. That was the first chain reaction. Not because I raised my voice, because official people started asking official questions in places where my mother's grief language could not protect her. Donors noticed before my family admitted anything. Eleanor Ross, who had been writing 5-figure checks since my father was alive, quietly asked for a compliance update before confirming her next pledge. One regional education donor moved their spring contribution into pending status until governance clarity returned. The local reporter never ran the glowing succession piece my mother had imagined after the gala. Instead, she asked the board for comment on interim control questions. That phrasing alone was enough to make the room colder. Student families noticed too, though more softly. One mother emailed asking whether the scholarship luncheon promises were still real. Another asked whether the awards would be delayed because we heard the foundation is reorganizing. There it was. The lie had already drifted past the ballroom and into households. That did not deserve to be used as scenery for my family's transition fantasy. My mother hated that part most. Not that the controls were frozen, not that the board had gone formal, that strangers had started asking the exact questions I had been answering alone for 5 years. She tried every register she still had left. First she called me punitive, then bitter. Then she moved into the softer, meaner vocabulary women like her always use when rescue starts getting expensive. "You are punishing students now," she said in one voicemail. "You are punishing your father's memory," she said in another. What she never said was the truth. She had tried to hand Marissa a foundation held together by my endowment authority, my portal controls, my filing chain, my donor credibility, and my willingness to stay invisible. The second invisibility ended, so did the fantasy that Marissa's warmth counted as governance. I did not rescue the whole foundation, but I did one narrow ethical thing, because boundaries are not the same as collateral cruelty. Through counsel, I authorized a one-time continuity memo for already approved scholarship students, whose awards had been lawfully committed before my mother decided a memorial gala was the right place to improvise succession. Nothing broader. No new public commitments. No fresh campaign release. No quiet portal reopening so Marissa could keep posting smiling photos about impact while the controls underneath her stayed frozen. Just one controlled act separating actual students from the mythology that had created the mess. After that, I became unavailable in the only way that matters. Written only. Every donor question through counsel. Every board question through counsel. Every, "Can we just talk as family?" ignored unless it came attached to an actual governance issue and an actual document. About a month after the luncheon, the grant board requested a formal declaration confirming that no transfer of endowment authority, donor platform administration, or compliance signer responsibility had been approved, and that any contrary public representation had been made without my consent. The donor platform wanted matching written confirmation for its risk file. Our outside accountant wanted the same clarity for the annual state and IRS sequence. I reviewed all three, corrected one date on the luncheon chronology, tightened one sentence about release authority, and signed them that same afternoon. No embellishment, no revenge speech, no daughterly heartbreak hidden inside nonprofit language. Just a clean record. That was more devastating than any scream I could have made at the gala, because once the facts were fixed in the board file, the donor file, and the compliance chain, my mother could no longer keep narrating me into the role of bitter older daughter instead of the woman who had quietly kept my father's foundation lawful. Facts do not grieve. They do not clap at memorials. They do not care who looked warm under ballroom lights. They just sit there until everybody else's prettier version runs out of room. A month later, my mother asked to meet, and I almost said no because by then I understood something I had spent most of my adult life trying not to understand. Closure is not the same thing as restored access, and access is not the same thing as love. Still, I agreed to one final meeting because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could soften it back into memorial language. We met at 4:37 on a Thursday in my attorney's conference room, late Raleigh light flattening against the blinds, stale coffee cooling untouched near the side credenza, and the kind of dry office air that makes every sentence sound more official than the speaker intended. Elaine arrived first in one of her pale wrap blouses, the kind she wore when she wanted to look maternal, burdened, and morally innocent all at once. Howard came in next with the posture of a man who had spent years standing beside the wrong decisions and still hoped that counted as dignity. Marissa came last. No luncheon smile now, no foundation pin, just a woman who had finally learned that being photographed with students is not the same thing as carrying a compliance chain. My mother opened exactly the way I knew she would. Not with apology, with hardship. "This has been devastating for the family," she said. There it was, the old rearrangement. Blur the damage, make it communal, make it sound like weather so nobody has to name where it began. I let the silence sit there long enough to become useful, then I gave her the cleanest sentence I had. "You handed Marissa a foundation identity built on my endowment authority, my donor controls, my filing chain, and my labor, then expected me to keep it all lawful after telling me I could manage money but not a legacy." My mother cried after that, and maybe the tears were real. They usually are by the time consequence finally reaches people who thought sentiment counted as governance. But tears are weather, not proof, and I had finally learned not to confuse visible pain with accountability. Howard tried next because men like him always step in after the first softness fails. "We were trying to protect your father's legacy," he said. "That's all this ever was." I looked at him and felt nothing but accuracy. "No," I said. "That's what you told yourselves. What it actually was another public crown built on the assumption that I would absorb the risk and disappear behind it." Marissa spoke then, and the saddest part was that she still sounded more confused than ashamed. "Mom said you'd understand," she said. "I thought the legal part would work itself out." There it was, the whole family structure in one sentence. She got the stage, I got the system. She got the warmth. I got the filings, the donor scrutiny, the endowment controls, the ugly back end, and the part nobody wanted to romanticize while it was saving them. "That was always the luxury you were given," I told her. "Other people were assigned the seriousness for you." My mother asked the fantasy question after that, the one families like mine always ask once the useful daughter is still physically in the room, but no longer psychologically available on command. "Is there any way to fix this?" she said. That line might once have worked on me because I used to hear vague pain and immediately start converting it into labor, a release, a statement, a softened consequence, a way to keep everyone from having to feel the full shape of what they did. But by then I knew the difference between being needed and being loved, and they are not interchangeable no matter how many mothers cry when the controls stop protecting them. "You can't fix this with emotion," I said. "You can only live with what you tried to do without turning me into the repair plan again." Then I told them what accountability actually meant. Not tears in a conference room after the public story had already failed. Not calling me family now that the donors, the board, and the filing chain had all stopped cooperating. Accountability is changed behavior that costs you something. Accountability is telling the truth before the record forces it. Accountability is admitting out loud that you used one daughter as infrastructure while praising the other for standing on it. Elaine flinched at that because it was the first sentence in the room she could not decorate. Howard asked if everything now had to go through lawyers. "Anything involving the foundation, money, donor contact, scholarships, filings, compliance, or emergency rescue does," I said. "For anything else, maybe one day, if behavior changes before language does." That was the real answer. Not reconciliation, not permanent exile. Structure. Distance. Terms. 6 weeks later, I accepted an executive finance role at a regional education nonprofit, the kind of position nobody hands to a woman by accident, and nobody keeps unless she knows exactly how to protect mission from performance. A month after that, I bought a quiet townhome in my own name on the edge of downtown Raleigh. Clean title, tall windows, and no family mythology hidden in the walls. The silence there felt better than any apology they could have improvised. No gala, no flowers, no photograph of my father being used to bless a lie. Just a closing packet, a set of keys, and the first space I had ever entered that did not already expect my labor in exchange for belonging. Then my attorney sent the final notice. Clean, narrow, non-negotiable. I would never again fund, file, shield, administer, or quietly operate any family legacy that erased me in public and expected my competence in private. No more off-record rescue. No more, do this for your father. No more grief language used as a solvent for governance. I approved the letter without changing a word. That was the deeper revenge. Not that Marissa lost the public crown. Not that my mother had to watch the new chapter collapse under frozen controls, donor scrutiny, and filing questions. Not even that Howard finally had to learn the difference between legacy and access. The deeper revenge was this. I was no longer available for the role they had written for me. I was not the hidden administrator, not the donor firewall, not the daughter who kept the mission lawful while someone else got photographed beside it. They did not miss me as family. They missed the function. Too many families call that legacy because admitting the difference would force them to look at what they built. So tell me honestly, if your family only remembered your value when the endowment, the donor portal, or the filing chain were at risk, would you ever let them back in once you finally put your own name on a life they could not use? And what would have been your breaking point? The microphone at the gala, the frozen scholarship funds, the staged luncheon, or the moment you realized they never really meant legacy in a way that included your dignity?